It is 6:30 in the morning, June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" Donovan has his face buried in wet sand and rusting steel. He is hugging the shadow of a Czech hedgehog, one of those ugly, welded X-shaped obstacles the Germans seeded into the surf. Waves slap at his boots. Salt water runs down his neck. Every breath tastes of metal, cordite, and blood. 18 inches above his helmet, the air is a sheet of noise. The MG-42 on the bluff is firing a long, steady burst. The sound isn't a normal machine gun rattle. It's a tearing scream, 20 or more rounds every second, blurring into a single ripping buzz. Hitler's buzzsaw. Around him, men are trying to become part of the beach. Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, is being shredded in front of him in real time. Bodies in life belts float in the shallows. Some are moving. Most are not. 50 yards ahead, half hidden in concrete and rock, German firing slits spit flame. Tracer rounds stitch the tide line. Mortar shell bursts kick up geysers of water and sand. On the right, a Sherman that made it off the ramp is burning, turret blown open like a kicked can. Behind Donovan, the English Channel is full of boats, wrecks, smoke, and men. Always more men, leaping off landing craft into water that might be waist-deep or over their heads. He presses his chest harder into the cold, slick sand and tightens his grip on the weapon across his arms. It is a Thompson submachine gun, M1928A1 pattern. Not the newer, stripped-down M1 the Army likes now. The old gangster gun. It has the finned barrel, the cuts compensator, the top cocking handle. And in place of a straight box magazine, a fat, round drum hangs under the receiver. 50 rounds of .45 ACP in one heavy lump of blued steel. The drum makes the gun feel like a typewriter bolted to a length of pipe. The whole package weighs. It's nearly 12 pounds loaded. It is awkward in the hands. It rattles a little when it is not full. His squad leader told him it was a stupid choice. Drums jam, Staff Sergeant Harker had said back in England. They're old, they're heavy, and if they go down on you in the open, you're dead. Mickey had just shrugged. I don't want to be the guy reloading with 3 men between me and a German machine gun, he'd said. Give me weight now, I'll deal with it later. Harker had rolled his eyes, then signed off on the request. They had a few old drums in the company arms chest. Nobody else wanted them. Now, with bullets buzzing over his head and men coughing their lungs out into the surf, Mickey is about to find out if his stubbornness was genius or suicide. 20 yards up the beach to his left, the platoon lieutenant had tried to stand and move. He didn't make it 3 steps. A burst from the MG-42 caught him through the chest. He fell backward, arms splayed, helmet spinning into the foam. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then a sergeant further down yelled something about flanking the pillbox. Another man tried to rise and was cut in half. Somebody has to move, Harker had rasped beside him. We die here or we die there. If somebody doesn't get close to that gun, we all die here. A mortar shell landed close by, turning the world into white spray and brown mud for a heart-stopping second. When Mickey's hearing came back, Harker wasn't yelling anymore. He was lying on his side, eyes open, not blinking. A piece of shrapnel the size of a thumb had taken most of the back of his skull. Now the squad has no leader. The platoon has no officer. The beach is a killing floor, and the MG-42 in that pillbox is still smashing every attempt to stand. Mickey risks a glance over the edge of the hedgehog. He can see the firing slit now. It's a darker rectangle in the bluff, maybe half the size of a man. Muzzle flash flickers there, rapid and relentless. The team inside that concrete box are doing their job well. Between him and that slit is open sand with a scattering of corpses and 3 more hedgehogs. No cover worth the name, except what he's already under. Someone further back screams, "We're pinned! We're all gonna—" Mickey ducks as another burst rips by. Sand stings his neck. He rolls the Thompson slightly, feeling the weight of the drum against his palm. 50 rounds, 5 full stick magazines worth, in one load. If the thing feeds, if it doesn't seize up with half the 50 still trapped inside. He remembers Harker's words, the armorer's warnings, the ordnance bulletins that said drums were out, obsolete, banned from new prod. Auction. He also remembers another number, something he'd read in a British training pamphlet the last time he was on guard duty and bored out of his skull. Most men caught in the open by MG-42 fire on a flat beach live for about 30 seconds. 30 seconds. He looks at the pillbox, at the killing arc it commands, then back at the drum. If I'm going to die in the next 30 seconds anyway, he mutters to himself, I'd rather do it with 50 rounds going out than 30. He pulls his knees up under him. Around him, the air is still full of screaming and shell noise. Company A is dying. Some men are trying to crawl backward toward the water. Others are frozen. Mickey pushes the selector lever on the Thompson down to full auto. He checks the latch on the drum one last time, feels it click, solid. He knows the drum's reputation. Unreliable, heavy, too slow to reload, a relic of gangsters and prohibition. He requested it anyway. In 10 seconds, he's going to get up and run at a machine gun nest that has already killed his officer and his squad leader. In 10 seconds, he will find out if that round, rattling hulk of steel in his hands is a nightmare only for him, or also for the Germans who have never seen an American pour 50 rounds back at them without stopping. He takes one long, deliberate breath. On 3, he tells the empty air. 1, 2. Cut to black. Mickey Donovan grew up on stories of Thompsons long before he ever touched one. Not war stories. Crime stories. On the south side of Chicago in the 1920s and 30s, the word Tommy gun didn't mean army issue. It meant gangland. He'd been 10 years old when an older cousin whispered about the St. Valentine's Day massacre. 7 men lined up against a garage wall, cut nearly in half by men in fake police uniforms carrying squat, drum-fed guns. At 14, working deliveries for his uncle's bar, he'd heard regulars talk about John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson. Names followed by phrases like sprayed the joint and cut the car to pieces, and always Thompson. The mental picture fixed early, short barrel, forward grip, round drum, a gun that turned a room into rags. When he enlisted in 41, he expected to be handed a Garand or a Springfield. Instead, at Camp Wheeler, they taught him 2 things at once: how to shoot a rifle like a proper infantryman, and how to run a squad. He had a good head for people, if not for officers' school. He liked being close enough to touch the men he was responsible for. The first time he saw a Thompson in uniform was in the hands of a captain at a live fire demonstration. This, the captain had said, holding up an M1928A1 with a straight 20-round magazine, is your submachine gun. Some of you will carry it. Most of you will not. It is heavy, expensive, and the generals don't trust it. They think it belongs in movies about gangsters. There had been laughter. The captain had fired a short burst into a silhouette target at 40 yards. The 45 ACP rounds chewed a fist-sized hole in the cardboard torso. Nobody laughs at what it does to a man at this range, the captain had added. In the classroom, they got the official story. John T. Thompson had designed the gun in World War I, hoping to give trench raiders something with more bite than a bolt-action rifle. The war ended before the design reached the front. The 20s and 30s filled the gap. Police departments bought some. So did the badgeless side of law enforcement. Al Capone's outfit, bank robbers, anyone who could pay $200 a unit. By the late 30s, the gun's reputation was as much about pinstripe suits as uniforms. When Europe exploded in 1939, that changed. Britain found itself with too few modern light automatics and too many Germans. They went shopping. Between 1940 and 41, the British ordered more than 100,000 Thompsons from Auto Ordnance. Commandos and paratroopers carried them on raids into Norway and France. American observers took note. Small units with lots of automatic firepower up close could do ugly, efficient work. But the U.S. Army, as an institution, didn't fall in love easily. The M1928A1, as shipped, was heavy, 10-plus pounds empty, expensive, roughly $200 a piece, in 1940 dollars, machined to fine tolerances that gobbled up production time. It also had an awkward split personality when it came to feeding. You could run it with 20 and 30 round stick magazines, or 50 and 100 round drums. On paper, drums looked good, 50 or 100 rounds before you had to reload. In a trench or a tunnel, that mattered. In tests, they were a headache. The 50-round Type YT drum, loaded with 45 ACP, weighed nearly 3 pounds. The 100-round C drum was a 5.5-pound chunk by itself. Both had complex internal springs that had to be wound with a key. Both rattled when partially loaded. Both hated dirt and sand. In peacetime trials, you could baby them. In field conditions, not so much. Ordnance officers noticed. By early 1942, they had a simple list. Drums jam in dust and mud. They give away a man's position when half empty. They cost too much. The gun doesn't need that complication. The answer was the M1 Thompson. Simplified receiver, side-charging handle, no cuts compensator, no provision for drums, only box magazines. Price per unit plummeted from around $200 to under $80. Production soared. In 1942 alone, nearly 300,000 M1s rolled out. By 1943, the M1928A1 variant stripped even more niceties. At ordnance conferences and in training pamphlets, the line was clear. Drum magazines are obsolete, unreliable, unsuitable for combat. Stick magazines are the standard. If you were a staff officer, writing memos, or a colonel planning divisions on map boards, that was the end of it. If you were a staff sergeant who had to cross open ground under fire and you knew you would only get a handful of seconds to shoot before dying, the story looked different. In England, training for the invasion, Mickey had watched British veterans clean their old M1928s. Some had stick mags, some had drums, illegal, unofficial, still quietly treasured. A Scottish commando sergeant had seen him eye a 50-rounder once and smirked. "Don't listen to the clerks," the Scot had said, tapping the big drum. "They dinna like anything they canna count on a neat wee form. This devil here fed me down a church aisle in Dieppe, and I never had to stop to stuff another box in." "Does it jam?" Mickey had asked. "Aye," the Scot had admitted. "If you treat it like shite, if you clean it, wind it right, and keep it out of the worst muck, it sings." Mickey remembered that voice months later when the company armorer in a Nissen hut near a rainy Ingley. Eschfield had opened an old battered crate. Inside, under an oily rag, lay 3 50-round drums. "Relics," the armorer had said. "Leftovers from the old days. They're not on my books. They're basically trash." Mickey had reached for one like someone touching a piece of history. "Can I sign one out?" he'd asked. The armorer had frowned. "Why?" he said. "You know the M1 you've got won't take it. Magazine well's different." "I'm not carrying an M1, Mickey said. "I've got a M1928A1 in my toe slot, for the squad leader." The armorer had chewed his lip. "They told us to stop bringing these forward," he'd finally said, nodding toward the drums. "But they also told us 41 was going to be the last year of this war, so what the hell do they know?" He'd pushed the drum across. "Wind it right. Keep it out of sand if you can, and don't cry to me if it locks up on you and gets you killed." Mickey had smiled. "If I get to blame you from wherever I end up, Sarge," he'd said, "I'll be happy I made it that far." Now, on Omaha Beach, with the MG-42 screaming and men dying all around him, that choice had come due. He wasn't behind a Prohibition-era sedan. He wasn't in a Chicago alley. He was one of a few dozen men pinned under artillery and machine gun fire on a strip of wet sand that smelled exactly like the inside of an abattoir. And the thing in his hands, rattling faintly with 100 fat 45s, was about to either justify its gangster reputation in the best way or prove every ordnance man right in the worst way. The assault plan for Omaha, as printed, was neat. Landing craft hit the beach on time. Engineers blew gaps in obstacles. Infantry pushed up in waves, supported by tanks and naval gunfire. Strong points were flanked, suppressed, or neutralized by combined arms. On paper, you did not have a platoon flattening itself behind a line of beach obstacles, while one MG-42 swept the tide line like a reaper. On paper, Company A of the 116th didn't die by the dozens in the first 15 minutes. Mickey watched the disconnect in real time. They'd hit the sand under sporadic artillery and small arms fire. The plan had said the naval barrage and air bombardment would crater the German positions into irrelevance. The reality showed clean walls, intact wire, and machine gun nests that looked barely scuffed. They'd tried to push forward as a line. Men had risen singly or in pairs, sprinting toward the seawall, only to be chopped down by the overlapping arcs of MG-42s. The gun that had killed the lieutenant had a perfect field of fire, down a shallow draw, across a strip of open beach, right into the spot where the landing craft had vomited them onto sand. The victims never saw the barrel. They saw only the effect. Men jerked sideways or seemed to crumple straight down. Packs and lifebelts burst open. Sea spray mixed with something darker. By the book, you answered a machine gun nest with base of fire from supporting weapons. Flanking movement by a fire team or squad. Grenades into the aperture. Or, if available, tank fire or explosives. On Omaha, tanks were burning. Engineers were dead or scattered. Radios were soaked and unreliable. Base of fire. Everyone with a rifle who tried to rise long enough to aim got stitched. Flanking movement. The right flank was a chaos of bodies and barbed wire. The left was worse. Grenades. You had to get within throwing range. Mickey turned his head, just enough to see who was left around him. To his right, Private O'Malley lay face down, unmoving. To his left, Garcia was pressed into the sand, mouthing a prayer in Spanish, knuckles white around his garand. Two more men huddled behind another hedgehog 10 yards closer to the surf. One of them had a bar. The big automatic rifle's barrel smoked. It had spat a few bursts earlier. Now every time the gunner tried to raise it, the MG-42's next traverse bracketed him. They were 4, maybe 5 men from what had started as a platoon block. Behind them, more bodies floated in their lifebelts. A Higgins boat burned slowly in the shallows. The book said, maintain momentum. The blood said, anyone who stands dies. Mickey knew the MG-42's weaknesses because he'd been paying attention in training. The buzzsaw could fire at up to 1,200 rounds per minute on cyclic, but no smart German crew ran it that way for long. Belts overheated, barrels warped, overlong bursts chewed up ammo and made the gun harder to control. Crews trained to fire in controlled groups, short bursts, barrel changes every few hundred rounds. There was a window, small but there, during a barrel change. He heard the first hint of it as a change in the sound. The unbroken rip dropped to single snapping barks. Then, briefly, to nothing. Men all along the line felt it. "There!" someone shouted in English and hopeless courage. "He's changing! Go! Go now!" One soldier got to his knees and took 2 strides before another MG on the flank keyed in and cut him down. The enemy had depth in their defenses, interlocking arcs, one nest taking up when the other had to cool. Mickey ground his teeth into the grit on his lips. Somewhere, down the chain, a captain was dying in the same way as a private. None of the doctrine diagrams on the walls back in England had accounted for the sheer density of German fire. Back in the Nissen huts, ordnance pamphlets had made pronouncements. Drum magazines impractical for modern infantry use. Stick magazines sufficient for intended role. He wondered, bitterly and briefly, what the intent had been here. It didn't matter. What mattered was that right now, if he tried to do the correct thing, pop up with a 30-round stick in his Thompson, dump half of it toward the slit, then drop out of sight to reload, he'd be exposed twice as long, once to shoot, once to slam another mag in. If the gun even saw his muzzle. If he didn't trip in a crater or snag on wire halfway up. He looked down at the fat drum again. He knew its flaws. It was heavy. It might jam. It would be a pig to reload if he somehow survived long enough to need a second run. But for 5 seconds of sprint, Then however many seconds of blind, desperate fire he could put into that slit, it offered him something the lighter, better M1 Thompson could not. 50 continuous chances to matter before he had to stop. He licked salt off his teeth and made his choice. "Mickey," Garcia croaked, "what are you doing?" "Advancing the plan," Mickey said. His voice was very calm, calmer than he felt. "Cover me if you can, or just don't stand up." He rolled his shoulders, dug his boots into the sand, and brought the Thompson in tight to his chest, barrel angled slightly up. If the drum jammed in the first 10 rounds, he'd never know. If it fed, the men in that pillbox were going to meet the American answer to the word buzzsaw. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat and saw his uncle back in Chicago, laughing in a smoky bar, calling the old Thompsons typewriters that wrote in lead. He opened them to the present. "Now," he whispered, and went. He had not gotten that drum easily. Back in England, it had taken more than a casual ask. The M1928A1 in the company arms list was technically for the platoon leader, meant as a badge of office as much as a tool, an automatic weapon tucked in a command post. Mickey had been acting squad leader long enough that the lieutenant didn't mind him babysitting it on live fire days. The lieutenant preferred his carbine, lighter, easier on his back. The first time Mickey had taken the .28 to the range, it had worn a 30-round stick. He'd liked the way it hit. At 50 yards, he could put a short burst into a silhouette's center mass and feel the target frame shudder. The recoil was a push, not a snap. The sights, while crude compared to his rifle, were good enough up close. He could also feel how fast the gun ate magazines. 30 rounds at a comfortable cadence lasted maybe 3 seconds of continuous fire. Reload. 3 seconds of fumbling under stress. Slap, rack, back up. If you had cover, fine. If you did not, those 3 seconds could be an eternity. The British commando's story about Dieppe had stuck in his head. "How many times did you reload?" Mickey had asked him. "Not once till I was out of the nave," the Scot had said. "You didn't want to start counting in a church with Jerry's on both sides, trust me." In the Nissen hut armory, under dim yellow light, the 3 50-round drums had looked like museum pieces. Curved ribs, round back plate with winding keyholes, patent stamps. The armorer had sighed when Mickey picked one up. "You don't want that," he'd said. "That's for newsreels of G-men jumping out of Packards." "I want it," Mickey had replied. They'd gone through the ritual, winding the internal spring with the key until the armorer could feel the right tension. Not too tight, not too loose. Loading the 45 rounds in, 5 at a time, into the spiral track, each one adding weight, each one a little chunk of potential. Snapping the back plate on until the latches caught with a solid, comforting click. The armorer had shown him how to check it. "Tap it," he'd said. "If it rattles too much, you loaded it wrong. If it doesn't rattle at all, you might have overwound it. We want a small rattle when it's half full." The drum Mickey had finally slotted onto his .28 had passed the test. On the range, they'd done a live trial. Mickey had stepped up behind a line of silhouettes at 20 yards. The other men had watched with a mix of curiosity and scorn. "You gonna spray the whole bloody county, Mickey?" Garcia had jeered. "Hope you brought your own ammo," O'Malley had muttered. Mickey had flicked the selector to full auto and squeezed off a quick 1-second burst. The Thompson's nose climbed, the drum pulling its balance sideways, but he'd muscled it down. 15 rounds, 3 per target, across the first bank. He'd let go, heart pounding, then counted the fresh holes. All on paper, all in torsos. No jam. The armorer had grunted. "Again," he'd said. They'd run the drum out in controlled series. 10 rounds, 15, shorter bursts, slower cadence. By the time the last of the 50 clanked up the feed tower and flew out the muzzle, the gun was hot, and Mickey's arms were aching. But not once had the spring stuttered. The backplate held. The feed lips, carefully deburred by the armorer, hadn't hiccuped. They'd opened the drum afterward. The inside was clean, the grease distributed right. "It'll work," the armorer had conceded. "Until it doesn't. Just remember, if sand gets in there, it's a paperweight." "I'll try not to drop it on the beach," Mickey had said. He'd gotten permission, grudgingly, to carry the .28 with the drum for the invasion. Officially, no one wanted to know. "On my paper," the company commander had said, "you have a perfectly ordinary M1 Thompson with stick mags like everyone else. If some inspector asks, that's the story. I'm not explaining why my man's carrying a Prohibition Museum exhibit on Uncle S.'s dime." "But if that museum exhibit knocks out a nest on the day," Mickey had asked, "you're not going to complain, right?" The captain had given him a long look. "If you're still breathing to tell me about it," he'd said, "I'll buy you the fanciest whiskey behind any bar we find in France." That had been a lifetime ago. Before the ramp dropped, before the fire came in, before the neat stacks of plans turned into dying men on actual sand. Now pressed behind steel and stone, Mickey has one old-world weapon, loaded with an old-world magazine, in a new kind of war. He is about to find out if yesterday's obsolete can solve today's problem better than the newest shaved-down Doctrine. In a bone-dry concrete room carved into the bluff above Omaha, Obergefreiter Karl Binder worked the MG-42 like a man running a factory machine. It was to him just that, a machine for turning cloth and meat into silence. He'd done this in Italy, in Russia, now in France. The nest he commanded was textbook. Firing slit angled to sweep the length of the beach, overhead cover of thick poured concrete, a belt of ammunition feeding from a box at his assistant's knee, a periscope pipe for observation when he wasn't firing, safe from direct return shot. Ahead, the enemy came off their little boats in lines that dissolved the moment the ramps fell. He'd been told the Americans were brave. He'd seen it with his own eyes now. They did not often fall back. They tried again and again to stand. The MG-42 didn't care about bravery. He feathered the trigger, making short, brutal bursts. He saw one group try to surge toward a gap between obstacles. He swept the line. 3 helmets spun. Bodies dropped. He saw an officer pointing, shouting something, pistol in hand. One controlled sweep across his midsection, and the officer folded, the men near him stumbling in confusion. The sound in the bunker was deafening. Hot brass rattled down the chute into a catchbox. The barrel shimmered. After each belt, his assistant snapped on asbestos mitts, twisted the locking collar, and swapped in a fresh tube of steel. From his perspective, each attack looked the same. Heads up, a few shots from their rifles, then heads down again or heads gone. He noticed one difference, perhaps 20 minutes into the slaughter. Most of the enemy fired single shots or short bursts from their rifles and light automatics. Occasionally, a burst from a .30 cal machine gun arced uselessly toward his slit, sparks pecking at the edges of the embrasure. Then, as he was scanning for the next clump of helmets to cut down, then something else happened. A man with a short, dark shape in his hands broke from behind one of the steel X-obstacles. He had seen Thompsons before, in photographs of American gangsters and papers, and once in Sicily, in the hands of a British paratrooper. He recognized the front grip and the profile. He had never seen one with that big, round drum hanging off the bottom in battle. The man ran in a crouch, fast, spraying short, ugly bursts toward the slit. Binder's gun was momentarily cooling. He was between belts. He grabbed for the assistant's next ammo box and hissed for his loader to hurry. By the time the MG-42's bolt slammed forward on fresh rounds, the American with the strange submachine gun had reached the next obstacle. He didn't go prone. He kept moving. In Binder's periscope, the image jumped, then steadied. The American's shoulders were hunched, his mouth open in a shout, muzzle of the Thompson spitting orange flame. The sound reached them a heartbeat later, a dull, throbbing roar very different from the buzzsaw's shriek. Binder brought the MG-42 up, pressed his cheek to the stock and squeezed. Sand jumped inches behind the running man as Tracer streaked low. The American ducked, almost falling, then recovered, slammed into a dip in the beach, and popped up again, closer. He was pouring fire in the entire time, not in wild, flailing arcs, but in deliberate 8-10-round gusts that ate into the embrasure's edges. Chunks of concrete chipped away under the .45's impacts. One slug, by luck or stubborn physics, ricocheted into the bunker, whining off the inner wall and making the loader flinch. Binder cursed and adjusted, conscious now not only of the men in the surf, but of this single figure clawing closer with a gun that did not seem to run dry. He'd seen American Thompson uses before. They'd fire in quick bursts, then drop out of sight to fumble a new box magazine in. That was the moment you pinned them, when their weapon was silent and their hands were busy. This one wasn't pausing. Binder swept a burst, but the American had learned something in the last seconds. He hugged the low spots, darting from shell hole to chunk of shingle, firing almost the whole time. It felt, Binder thought, absurdly, like one of those crime newsreels they showed before the war. A man in a hat with a drum-fed Tommy gun walking fire across a row of rival gangsters. Except now the men being sprayed wore field gray, and the room being chewed was his. A round smacked into the lip of the firing slit and sent a sliver of concrete into his cheek. He flinched, more from surprise than pain. From behind him the rifleman assigned as close-in Gu. Ard shouted something he couldn't quite catch over the gun noise. Albtraum, something. Nightmare. Later, when the survivors tried to describe it, that was the phrase that stuck. Der Albtraum, the nightmare. The nightmare gun. To the Americans on the beach, it was just Mickey's stubborn choice paying off. To the Germans grinding the trigger of their own machine gun and suddenly taking more incoming fire than they'd expected from a single point, it was a shock. They were used to Americans who fired in neat Doctrine-approved bursts and then ducked. They were not used to one who seemed to vomit .45 caliber slugs without stopping, closing the distance under a hose of lead that didn't offer them a reload gap to exploit. Binder tried to track him. He was still trying when the first .45 slug finally found the corner of the assistant's forehead. Blood and bones spattered the feeding hand. The belt sagged. Binder looked down for a fatal half-second. It was enough. When Mickey moved, the world narrowed to a tunnel. In front of him, the odd, tall arc of his front sight. Beyond that, the dark rectangle of the firing slit. Around it, flashes and chaos. He exploded from behind the hedgehog, boots slipping in the drag of the surf. For the first few strides, he felt naked. He'd been low for so long that standing felt like an act of insanity. The MG-42's last burst nipped the air behind him, stitching sand in his wake. He heard, more than felt, a bullet snap past his calf. He didn't stop. He had rehearsed this in his head a dozen times since the ramp dropped. 5 long strides to the next chunk of steel. Drop, fire, up, 5 more. Now, with the real thing trying its best to cut him in half, the steps telescoped. 1. The Thompson against his chest, drum digging into his forearm, selector on full auto. 2. He squeezes the trigger in a short pulse. The gun bucks. He feels the heavy drum tugging the muzzle sideways and fights it, arms already burning from the run. The .45 rounds smack into the face of the bluff, spitting chips of stone and dirt around the slit. 3. Sand kicks up around his boots from rounds raking past. Someone shouts his name behind him. He doesn't look back. 4. He dives into a shallow scoop in the sand that might have started as a shell crater or just a wave cut. He lands hard, rolls onto his side, brings the Thompson up, and empties a half-second burst into the slit again. Concrete chips fly. Inside he can't see, but he hopes. He sees the MG-42's muzzle flame stutter, then pause. He's 40 yards from the pillbox now. The difference between the men in that gun room living to swap another barrel and dying behind their shield may be 3 seconds. He has no intention of giving them 3. He's up again, feet pumping, Thompson muzzle low, breath burning in his lungs. The weight of the drum is agony now. It swings him and tries to pull the gun offline with every step. A stick magazine would have been easier to handle. But a stick magazine would also have been empty already. The drum is not. He can feel it in the subtle difference in how it rattles. Still more than half full. As he runs, he fires again, walking the line of shots. Not the carefully aimed semi-auto fire of a range, not wild spray. Controlled rakes that he's practiced on moving targets, trusting the heavy .45 bullets to tear through anything soft behind that slit. Screams carry in odd ways through the bunker opening. He hears something, high and panicked, in a language he doesn't speak. Jetzt! Laden! Schnell! Now! Load! Quickly! He doesn't care what they're saying. He cares that the MG-42 isn't firing. He hits the base of the bluff and slams himself against the damp, cold concrete wall below the slit. He is so close now he can smell the Germans' breakfast on the air, coffee, sour bread, and the chemical tang of burnt powder. He slides sideways until he's just off to the right of the opening. From here, the gun inside cannot depress enough to catch him unless someone drags it off its traverse and sticks the muzzle right out. He slaps the fire selector up to single. Time to conserve what's left. He leans just enough and snaps 2 shots into the dark hole. A return shot cracks out. A rifle, not the machine gun. The bullet blows a chip out of the outer edge of the embrasure, inches from his face. He flinches, then angles lower, sends 3 more rounds in. There's movement inside, a shadow, a flailing arm. He empties the rest of the burst into that motion. The Thompson grinds through the rounds smoothly. No jam, no hitch, each pull rewarded with bark and recoil. Somewhere behind him, other GIs finally register that someone has made it all the way to the base of the pillbox. They surge. Grenades arc overhead. One clanks into the slit and bounces inside. Mickey flattens himself as the blast thuds behind the wall, dust and smoke belching from the opening. He's deafened, ears already ringing from everything that came before. He blinks grit out of his eyes and waits for a return burst that doesn't come. The MG-42 is silent. A sergeant from another squad appears at his elbow, panting, a satchel charge in his hands. "You still got rounds?" he shouts into Mickey's ear. Mickey lifts the Thompson, feeling the drum's new, lighter rattle. "Maybe 10, he yells back. "Cover me," the sergeant says, and scrambles up the side of the pillbox toward the rear entrance. Mickey moves to a better angle, puts the now almost empty drum's remaining rounds into any flicker of motion near the slit. There is none. By the time the satchel goes off inside, blowing the interior into powder and screams, the 50-round drum is finally dry. The bolt locks back on an empty chamber with a metallic click that Mickey hears as loudly as the explosion. He slaps the release, drops the spent drum into the sand, and pulls a stick magazine from his pouch with shaking fingers. Behind him, men are moving. They're using the gap he just helped open. Some are still being hit by other nests. Other guns are still talking further along the bluff. But this one, a key piece of the web, has been cut. Later, when prisoners are taken from other positions on the hill, one of them will mutter through broken English and translators German about the American with the round stomach gun, who ran at their fire and sprayed without end. Albtraumgewehr, he calls it. Nightmare rifle. The word sticks in the interrogation report's margin, underlined in pencil by an amused intelligence officer. To Mickey, sitting on the sand with his heartbeat thudding in his throat and his hands not quite steady on the new mag, it does not feel like a nightmare. It feels like exhaling for the first time in half an hour. He looks down at the empty drum in the sand. The thing is scarred now, scratches, a small dent where a bullet or fragment once kissed it, grease and sand, a veteran in its own right. "You did all right, you ugly bastard," he mutters. He doesn't have time to sentimentalize. There are other strong points, other arcs of fire, other impossible yards of open sand to cross. He slaps the 30-round stick into place, racks the bolt, and goes looking for the next problem. By the time the smoke over Omaha thinned, the official story of D-Day was already being written. Maps, arrows, names of beaches, and units. It had no line item for one staff sergeant with an illegal drum magazine on an old Thompson. After-action reports from his company noted, strong point at Sector Dog Green, neutralized by combination of automatic weapons and demolitions. That was true. The report didn't mention the armorer's unauthorized decision to let a sergeant carry a relic from the gangster era. It didn't mention a 50-round magazine that had broken the rhythm of a machine gun nest long enough for others to get close. In ordnance offices, far from the sand and the noise, the move away from drums to sticks continued. The M1 and M1928A1 Thompsons gave way, in turn, to cheaper, even simpler guns, like the M3 grease gun. Light, stamped, disposable. High-capacity, complex magazines were still viewed with suspicion. Heavy, jam-prone, expensive. Drum magazines became, again, museum pieces. But out in platoon tents and around mess tables, the story of Donovan's drum spread. Men who had been on that beach, or had heard from those who were, talked about that crazy bastard who ran 50 rounds at a pillbox without stopping. Some tried to scrounge drums of their own. Few succeeded. The supply was limited. Regulations tightened. In after-war memoirs, you see glimpses. And one man had an old-style Thompson with a drum like the gangsters in the newsreels. I thought he was mad until I saw what it did to Jerry's concrete. The Germans who survived long enough to be processed as POWs had their own footnotes. A few interrogation summaries from units behind the bluffs mention Allied submachine guns with large round magazines that allowed uninterrupted fire in an assault. One intelligence summary notes, Riley, enemy particularly disturbed by incidents in which U.S. SMG gunners appeared to fire without pause. Term Albtraumgewehr, nightmare gun, used by one Unteroffizier. After the war, Mickey went home. The Thompson did not. Army depots collected them, sold many off, cut some up. He traded the 12-pound hunk of walnut and steel for a civilian life that weighed different. He worked as a mechanic for a while, drove cabs, raised kids. Every now and then, he'd see an old photograph in a magazine or on TV. A grainy shot of a man on a beach, smoke all around, a familiar profile of gun in his hands with a round bulk under it. He'd squint, trying to decide if it was him or some other poor idiot with the same bad idea. He never found out. The Thompson itself changed roles over the years. It became a collectible, a prop in movies, the shorthand for mobsters and GIs alike. Drum magazines went with it in the public imagination. Soldiers in later wars carried different weapons with different feeding systems, Stanag magazines, belt boxes, quad stacks. But every time someone argued, in a platoon room or an internet forum years later, about the pros and cons of more rounds, more weight, more jams, versus lighter, simpler, reload often, they were walking ground. Donovan had already trod under fire. On the German side, old men at reunions sometimes mentioned a memory of a beach in France, of a day when their machine gun took man after man until one came with a gun that sounded wrong. A low, throbbing roar instead of a sharp rip. No pause to reload where there should have been one. One Unteroffizier, in a taped interview in the 70s, chuckled weakly and said, "We called it Die Albtraumwaffe, the nightmare weapon, that day. We did not like the sound of it." He waved a hand dismissively. "Of course," he added, "by then the whole war was a nightmare. One more strange gun did not change its end." He was right in one sense. No single man with a single weapon turned Omaha. But on strips of sand and edges of hedgehogs and up rough slopes under concrete teeth, small, ugly, individual decisions stacked up to carry a heavier gun, to strap on an obsolete magazine, to run at an embrasure when Doctrine said wait. Those decisions, multiplied by thousands, made the difference between a beachhead and a massacre. Decades later, in a display case in a small regimental museum, a battered 50-round Thompson drum sits next to a caption that reads, "Recovered on Omaha Beach, June 1944. Non-standard issue, likely privately retained by NCO. represents early attempt by individual soldiers to increase personal firepower beyond authorized tables. Visitors glance at it, glance at the photos, move on. Somewhere in a VFW hall, an old man with careful hands and a Chicago accent might tap his glass and say, "Ugliest thing I ever loved." He'd be talking about the drum that made his Thompson into a small portable nightmare for a few Germans in a concrete box above the surf on the longest day. History remembers the big arcs, overlords and armies, air fleets and armored divisions. It often forgets the small arcs. A staff sergeant, a crate under an armorer's bench, and a decision to trust 50 rounds in a suspect hunk of steel more than 30 rounds in a manual's good opinion. The Germans, that morning, did not care about procurement memos. They cared that when one particular American stood up and ran at them, his gun did not stop when they expected it to. For a few seconds on Omaha Beach, that was enough to earn it a name in their language. The nightmare gun.